The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. They call it the Polunsky Unit, a remote, concrete fortress deep in rural Texas, where men spend decades in solitary confinement, waiting for a single moment that many fear will never come: the execution date. Under harsh lights and behind steel bars, over 160 men now live on death row in Texas. Some arrived in their 20s. Others have watched their hair turn gray. 4 of them are women. Every name on that list represents a story, a life that ended violently, or a life that may have been tragically misunderstood. Tonight, we're going to walk through who these people are, how they got here, and what exactly awaits them behind the walls of Polunsky. But first, what does it feel like to stare down death, day after day, year after year, knowing your final moment could be just a court date away? As we begin, one voice echoes louder than the rest: Charles Victor Thompson, scheduled for execution in January 2026, after more than 26 years on death row. How did he get here? And what does his story, among hundreds in that prison, tell us about justice, mercy, and the system that puts people to death? As the night deepens, we hear the distant hum of the Huntsville execution chamber, the clang of gates closing, and the whispered prayers of inmates waiting for a date with fate. That's where our story begins. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The scream wasn't loud enough to travel past the concrete walls of the Polunsky Unit, but inside the death row wing, everyone heard it. A steel door slammed. Boots thundered across the floor. A guard shouted for backup. Somewhere down that corridor, a man had just learned the date that would end his life. Nobody knew who it was yet, but every inmate froze where he stood, because any one of them could be next. That silence, the heavy kind that feels like a weight pressing on the lungs, settled over the whole building like a warning. Texas death row has a rhythm. When officers move fast, it usually means something serious: a medical emergency, a fight, or an execution date being delivered. But today the energy felt different. Sharp, cold, final. In the deepest corner of the building, a man with a faded Lone Star tattoo on his forearm leaned against his cell door and closed his eyes. His name was Marcus Hall, and he had been on death row for 13 years. He whispered to himself that it couldn't be his turn. Not now. Not after everything he had been fighting for. Down the row, another inmate, Charles Thompson, sat on the edge of his metal bunk staring at the wall. He already had his date: January 2026. After decades of appeals, delays, reversals, and new trials, his story was entering its final chapter. Some inmates had grown old here. Some entered death row before TikTok, before smartphones, before the world felt as loud as it does now. Thompson had seen young men arrive with fresh tattoos and attitude, only to shrink into silence after their first year of solitary confinement. A death row cell in Texas is barely bigger than a walk-in closet. Concrete walls, a steel bunk, a small, narrow window, a toilet, a table bolted into the wall. Inmates spend nearly 23 hours a day alone, with no physical contact allowed, not even with family. Some lose their minds. Some find religion. Others carry their guilt like a shadow. And some still claim they didn't do the crime that put them here. Beyond the gates, Texas holds the largest active execution chamber in the United States. While most states have slowed or stopped executions, Texas continues steadily, carrying out more than any other state in modern American history. Right now, over 160 men and women sit on death row, waiting. 4 of them are women, living in a separate unit miles away, but connected by the same final destination in Huntsville, where executions take place. Today, word spread fast that new names were being processed. A fresh batch of inmates had arrived after capital trials across the state wrapped up. Some from Houston, some from Dallas County, some from small towns most people in America will never hear of. But one name in particular had everyone whispering: a younger man who barely looked old enough to shave, covered in black ink tattoos from his wrists to his neck. He had been sentenced only months ago for a triple murder during a home invasion. Officers walked him down the corridor slowly, his eyes darting from cell to cell, taking in the reality of the place he would now call home. But while new faces added tension to the unit, the older inmates were weighed down by something heavier: time. Years spent staring at the same walls. Years spent waiting for courts to decide their fate. Some had watched other men walk past their cells toward the execution chamber, never returning. They knew that once your name is picked, there is no pause button. The appeals shrink. The visits get emotional. The reality hits. For Marcus Hall, the man with the Lone Star tattoo, his crime had happened in 2011. A robbery that escalated into a killing. He always admitted he was there, but he swore he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. His co-defendant died years ago in prison. Marcus believed the system got him wrong. For 13 years, he pushed appeals, wrote letters, begged lawyers to look again at the evidence. Some days he believed he would walk free. On others, he felt the clock ticking. But nothing could prepare him for the sound of boots stopping outside his door. 2 officers stood there, one holding a clipboard. Hall stepped forward. His stomach dropped. He felt the world blur around him. He could see Thompson watching from a few cells away. New inmates watching too, learning what fear really looks like. Marcus pushed his hands through the slot in the door and let them cuff him. Sweat rolled down his face. This was the moment every man on death row dreaded. They walked him to a small, windowless room with a single metal desk. An officer closed the door behind him. A piece of paper sat on the desk. Marcus couldn't see the words yet. He didn't want to. His heart pounded. He tried to breathe. The officer sitting across from him didn't smile, didn't blink, didn't speak right away. When the officer finally did, the words cut deeper than any blade. The court has signed your execution date. Marcus felt everything inside him collapse. He couldn't speak, couldn't even move. His legs went numb. He looked down at his tattoo, faded, cracked, almost ghost-like now, and remembered getting it when he was 17, long before he ever imagined stepping foot inside a prison. But something strange happened next. The officer didn't slide the paper across the table. He didn't read the date. He didn't even confirm the name. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This isn't your date." Marcus blinked, confused. His breathing hitched. The officer continued, "This is notice of a hearing. The judge wants to review your case before deciding. You still have time for now." Marcus's whole body shook. That scream from earlier? That wasn't for him. It was for someone else. Someone whose time really had run out. When the officers walked him back to his cell, the other inmates didn't say a word, but they watched closely. They saw the way his hands trembled. They saw the way he leaned against the door after it closed. They saw the way he silently mouthed a prayer. He made it back. But he knew the truth now. His turn could come any day. And somewhere in that unit tonight, a man whose name nobody has spoken yet is packing up his few belongings, preparing for a move to the Huntsville Walls unit, where the execution chamber waits. The paper with his date is already signed. The question is, who is it? And what did he do to end up next in line? The name of the man chosen for the next execution didn't spread immediately. In Polunsky, news moved fast, but this time it traveled strangely slow, like it was dragging a shadow behind it. Men whispered guesses through the food slots of their doors. Some thought it might be a newcomer. Others believed it had to be someone who had been waiting for decades. But no one knew for sure. Marcus Hall lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment the officer gave him the temporary reprieve. A hearing. Not freedom. Not safety. Just a postponement while the judge reviewed his case again. It felt like being pulled back from the edge of a cliff only to be placed on a smaller, weaker ledge. He knew the ground could crumble at any second. Down the tier, officers were clearing a path. The clanging of keys echoed in the hallway. Boots marched in a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that signaled an inmate was being moved. Someone muttered, "This is it. They're taking him." Men pressed their faces to the narrow windows on their cell doors, trying to see. Finally, one of the officers appeared around the corner, carrying a small, clear property bag. Inside it were neatly folded clothes, a pair of canvas shoes, a Bible, a family photo, and a stack of letters. Behind him walked another officer, and between them was a middle-aged man with a shaved head and a tattoo of a rising phoenix on the back of his neck. His hands were cuffed, his feet shackled, and his face looked as though it had seen too many years inside the same four walls. It was Elias Monroe. Men in the cells went silent. Elias had arrived on death row in 2004. His case had been controversial for years. Some believed he had been unfairly tried. Others felt the evidence was clear. His appeals had slowly been denied over the last decade, until earlier that summer when the final petition was rejected. For the last few months, he'd been waiting quietly, writing letters to his sister in Oklahoma, reading books, and keeping mostly to himself. Now the wait was over. Elias kept his eyes forward, refusing to let fear show. But Marcus, watching him from 3 cells down, could see something raw flickering behind that calm expression. When Elias reached the area where the row turned into another hallway, he paused. He looked straight through the bars at Marcus. "Hold on to your time," Elias said, his voice steady. Marcus swallowed hard. "Elias, when?" "5 weeks," Elias cut in gently. "They said it for 5 weeks." No one else spoke. The officers tugged on the chain, guiding him forward. The steel door closed behind them, sealing off the hallway that led to the transport area. Elias would be moved to Huntsville in a few weeks, to the place where inmates spend their final days. There, they get contact visits, regular meals, and a small sense of calm before the procedure. But everyone knew what it really meant. It was the last stop. After the doors shut, the tension inside the row didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper. The arrival of his date made everything else feel more real. Marcus sat back down slowly, running his hand over his tattoo. The Lone Star he'd gotten when he thought he had the whole world ahead of him. Now it felt like a mark from another lifetime. Hours passed. The row stayed unusually quiet. Even the newer inmates, who normally spent their days pacing or calling out to each other, kept to themselves. It wasn't fear of Elias's crime. It was the reminder that every man here could one day walk the same path. Later that night, long after dinner trays were collected, Marcus heard a soft voice from the cell directly across from him. It was Javier Ghost Medina, a thin, young man covered in bright graffiti-style tattoos from collarbone to wrist. He was one of the newest arrivals, sentenced only a few months before for a deadly robbery that had shocked his community in San Antonio. "You ever talked to him before?" Ghost asked quietly. "Elias," Marcus replied. "A few times. He seemed peaceful." "That's what happens," Marcus said. "Some men get angry. Some get quiet. Elias got peaceful." Ghost leaned his forehead against the bars. Crazy how someone can be calm while walking toward that. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't know how. Peace wasn't something he understood anymore. He barely slept. His appeals sat stacked in folders like towering reminders of time. Even the smallest sounds, the rattle of chains, the buzz of doors, made adrenaline rush through his veins. That night, Marcus dreamed of free air, of sunlight that wasn't blocked by concrete, of his daughter, who he hadn't seen since she was a toddler. She was a grown woman now, with a life far outside these walls. He wondered if she'd ever think of him the way he thought of her, or if the world had taught her to forget. The next morning brought a rare shift in the unit's energy. Officers seemed on edge. A new rumor spread. State inspectors were coming for a routine check, which meant every cell had to be spotless. Beds made, toilets clean, floors wiped down. Even death row had rules that couldn't be ignored. While the men cleaned, the talk started again. Someone whispered that Elias had met with spiritual advisors that morning. Someone else claimed his sister was coming to see him before he left for Huntsville. And then someone, Marcus didn't see who, said the piece of news that truly rattled the tier. They're reviewing multiple cases next month. Judges want updates on pending appeals. Marcus's heart jolted. Multiple cases. That meant more names were moving. More hearings were coming. More decisions. Life or death decisions. He leaned back against the wall, trying to breathe. No matter how long he'd been here, the process never got easier. Every letter from attorneys brought hope or heartbreak. Every filing became a lifeline. Every denied appeal felt like a brick being added to a wall he was trying to climb. He closed his eyes, hearing again Elias's last words, "Hold on to your time." But time on death row wasn't like time anywhere else. It stretched. It bled. It circled back on itself. Days felt endless until suddenly, a single piece of paper could snap one in half. Around noon, officers escorted 2 men to the interview rooms for legal meetings. Others received paperwork. Ghost got a letter from his cousin. Thompson got a visit from his attorney. And Marcus got nothing. Sometimes no news was good news. Other times, it meant the calm before something devastating. Late that evening, just as the lights dimmed for the night cycle, an officer appeared at Marcus's door holding a single white envelope. His voice was flat, unreadable. Hull. Legal mail. Marcus froze. His heart hammered. His hands shook as he reached through the slot. The envelope felt thin. Too thin. Hope and dread tangled inside him until he felt sick. He stared at it without opening it. Ghost watched silently from across the way. Thompson, a few cells down, shifted on his bunk. Everyone sensed it. The moment that could change everything. Marcus finally tore it open. His eyes moved across the page. His breath stopped. Whatever was written there hit him like a blow he didn't expect. His hand dropped to his side. The letter fluttered out of his fingers. Ghost whispered, "Marcus, what does it say?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because the words on that paper meant everything in his life had just shifted, and not in the direction he'd prayed for. The letter trembled in Elias Reed's hands. Its contents were simple, yet crushing. The judge had denied his final appeal. His temporary reprieve was over. The execution date had been set. The calm he had clung to for weeks vanished in an instant, leaving a hollow emptiness in its place. He sank onto the narrow metal bunk, staring at the ceiling. Every detail of the cell, the chipped concrete, the small barred window, the steel toilet, felt sharper, more oppressive than ever. Across the tier, other inmates sensed the shift. Some watched silently, understanding too well what the letter meant. Some looked away, unwilling to meet the eyes of a man walking toward a final reckoning. From the cell opposite, a younger inmate spoke softly. "Elias, are you all right?" Elias didn't respond. Words felt useless. He had spent years waiting, fighting, hoping for some legal miracle, and now the endgame had arrived. The officers moving through the tier didn't care about feelings. For them, it was routine. For him, every clanging key and echoing boot step was a drumbeat counting down his last days. He thought about the years on death row, the monotony, the isolation, the passing of men whose names and faces had become part of the walls themselves. He thought about the newcomers, full of bravado and tattoos, still believing they could survive this place unscathed. One such young man leaned against his bars, watching Elias with a mixture of curiosity and fear. His name was Javier Ghost Medina, his skin inked with jagged, graffiti-style tattoos, a visible map of rebellion and mistakes. "You ever wonder if it gets easier?" Ghost asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "You learn to survive. You don't get used to it. You just survive." Hours crawled by. The attorneys came and went, discussing last-minute filings, petitions, and procedural matters that could no longer save him. Elias listened silently, taking in every word but knowing deep down that the verdict was final. There were no more loopholes, no more appeals, no more chances. By evening, the officers brought trays of food, sliding them under the doors with precision. Conversation on the tier was subdued, cautious. Each man, young and old, carried the weight of his own impending fate, and Elias's news hung in the air like a storm cloud. Elias organized his few belongings with deliberate care: a small Bible, letters from distant family, a photograph of his sister, folded neatly, and the clothes he would wear tomorrow. Each object carried significance. Each fold was a small attempt to impose order on a life dictated by the state. When the lights dimmed, silence enveloped the tier. Elias lay on the metal bunk, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional clanging of keys in distant corridors. He thought about the path ahead, the transport to Huntsville, the last days in a cell not his own, the final walk down the corridor toward a chamber that had claimed so many men before him. Ghost shifted in his bunk across the way. "Does it ever get easier, seeing them taken?" he asked quietly. Elias's lips pressed into a line. "No. You learn to carry it inside you. Every name that passes reminds you what could be you next. That's the hardest part." Late at night, a door slammed somewhere down the hall. The sound was different from the usual check or routine movement. It was precise, commanding attention. Every man on the tier paused, listening. It wasn't just noise. It was a signal. The process had begun. The machinery that moved life toward death was in motion again. Elias's chest tightened. He understood without seeing. One of his fellow inmates was being escorted, leaving the tier for the journey that would end in Huntsville. Each step echoed in his mind, reminding him that his turn approached with relentless certainty. Tomorrow, he would be moved. Tomorrow, the countdown would become tangible. The days of endless waiting would narrow into hours, hours into minutes. Everything that had sustained him, hope, routine, small acts of control, would be tested in ways that could break even the strongest men. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle over him, trying to find a fragile sense of calm. But deep down, he knew it was only temporary. Every sound, every movement, every shadow could be a reminder of what awaited. And the tier, usually a place of muted survival, felt suddenly smaller, heavier, and sharper. Elias whispered a silent promise to himself. He would face the day ahead with as much strength as he could muster. He would walk the corridors, follow the officers, and endure the journey to Huntsville. He would survive as long as he could, and in the quiet moments between movement and procedure, he would hold on to the fragments of his life that were truly his. And somewhere in the darkness of the unit, another man was being moved. Another name would be called. Another countdown had begun. The wheels of the system were turning, relentless and precise. And for Elias Reed, the night stretched long, heavy, and unyielding, with the weight of what tomorrow would bring pressing down on him like stone. The morning air was heavy and still when Elias Reed was escorted from his cell. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and his feet were shackled, the metal clinking softly with each step down the narrow corridor of Polunsky Unit. The familiar hum of the lights overhead and the distant echo of keys offered no comfort. Today was the beginning of the journey to Huntsville, where the final stage of his sentence would unfold. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one pressing the weight of inevitability into his chest. Ghost, still on the tier, watched silently from his bunk as Elias was led past. Elias did not turn to wave or speak. There was nothing left to say. Years on death row had stripped the need for words. Instead, he let his gaze fall forward, fixed on the path that would take him closer to the chamber he had feared and accepted in equal measure. The officers moved efficiently, forming a silent perimeter around him as they exited the building. Sunlight hit the barbed wire fences outside, glinting like steel teeth. The courtyard, usually filled with the faint hum of activity from maintenance crews or occasional outdoor exercise, was empty today. Only the sound of boots against concrete accompanied Elias's march. Inside the transport van, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint metallic scent of the restraints. The interior was cramped, lined with reinforced steel, seats bolted down, and a small window covered in wire mesh. Another inmate sat in the corner, silently staring at the floor. His skin was covered in faded tattoos, remnants of a past life that had ended abruptly, just like Elias's. Hours passed. The van rumbled along desolate highways, cutting through the flat Texas landscape. Occasionally, a guard would call out instructions or check the restraints, but otherwise, silence dominated the vehicle. The monotony of the ride contrasted sharply with the tension building in Elias's chest. Every mile brought him closer to the final moments that awaited in Huntsville. He thought about the men left behind, Ghost, Thompson, and others whose names he had memorized over the years. Some would continue their sentences for decades, while others might be called next. The system was relentless, impartial in its calculation but cruel in its precision. A single court order could change everything, or end everything. Arriving at the Walls unit in Huntsville, Elias was escorted through long, sterile corridors lined with steel doors. The hum of fluorescent lights was constant, unyielding, a reminder that this place had been designed to contain and control. Guards moved silently, signaling the path he must follow. Every step felt like a countdown, each footfall bringing him closer to the chamber where life and death would intersect. In the holding area, he was allowed a brief moment to collect himself. A small cell with a cot, a metal table, and a chair offered a semblance of solitude. Here, he could see the faded paint peeling from the walls and the small barred window high above, letting in a sliver of light. He ran his hands along the steel table, tracing the cold edges, trying to ground himself. An officer entered with a clipboard. "Final check. Anything you need." Elias shook his head. His focus was inward, collecting his thoughts, preparing for the routine that would follow him through the next hours. He thought about his tattoos, the Lone Star he had gotten on his forearm years ago, now faded and cracked, symbols of a life that felt distant. He touched them gently, as if drawing strength from the ink etched into his skin. The guards moved him to the visitation area briefly, where his sister awaited. She had traveled from Oklahoma, silent and composed, hiding the tremor in her hands and the tension in her eyes. They exchanged no words at first, just a look, a shared understanding that what they were about to experience was larger than language. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. Elias nodded, unable to speak. He understood her fear and love intertwined. She had come for closure, for connection, and perhaps for hope that some part of him would endure beyond this place. He clutched the small photograph of her in his pocket, a reminder of life outside the walls. After visitation, the preparations began in earnest. Officers instructed him to change into the clothes he would wear. He folded his personal items neatly and handed them over for secure storage. Each action, though simple, felt monumental. The weight of ritual, routine, and finality pressed down on him. The corridor leading to the execution chamber was long and silent, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of boots. As he walked, he saw other men being escorted in opposite directions. Some had already been processed, others waited for their own turn. Their faces told stories of fear, resignation, defiance, or despair. Elias felt their eyes on him, though they did not speak. Each glance was a reminder of the shared reality of death row, the constant proximity to mortality. Inside the chamber, he was guided to a waiting room. The walls were a stark white, the lighting harsh and unyielding. The atmosphere was sterile, clinical, yet heavy with the weight of anticipation. Here, inmates were allowed their last moments, small acts of reflection before the final procedure. Guards ensured order, moving with precision, speaking only when necessary. Elias sat on the metal bench, hands cuffed, but his mind racing. He replayed his life, his crimes, the victims, the appeals, the letters, and the small comforts he had clung to over the years. Each memory was sharp, precise, inescapable. He thought about the men he had met on death row, about Ghost and Thompson, about those who would continue to live here after him. The corridor outside echoed faintly with the sound of other preparations. A spiritual advisor arrived, a calm presence in the otherwise tense environment. They spoke quietly, words of reflection and reassurance, offering Elias a way to focus, to steady himself, to reconcile with what lay ahead. He listened, nodding occasionally, absorbing the tone rather than the exact words. The voice was grounding, cutting through the fear that had threatened to overwhelm him. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched and contracted as guards moved with methodical efficiency, checking restraints, reviewing documents, ensuring every detail was accounted for. Elias felt the weight of observation, every action scrutinized, every gesture noted. The room was filled with a quiet tension that pressed on the chest, demanding attention, respect, and compliance. As the final hour approached, Elias was led from the waiting room to the execution chamber itself. The corridor was narrow, the walls stark, the lighting unforgiving. Every step echoed, every movement heightened the sense of inevitability. He felt the combined presence of officers, the chamber's mechanics, and the silent witnesses as a tangible force. When he reached the chamber, he took a deep breath and steadied himself. The final preparations were simple, procedural, but heavy with significance. He seated himself, the restraints secured. The officers stepped back, the spiritual advisor remained, and the process began. Elias closed his eyes briefly, focusing on his breathing, on the weight of the moment, on the fragments of life he carried with him. Years of waiting, struggle, and reflection had led to this point. Outside, the world continued unaware, while inside these walls, time contracted, sharpened, and finalized. The door to the chamber clicked softly. Every sound was magnified. Every breath counted. The air, heavy with anticipation, pressed down on him. He felt the distance between life and death shrink to a singular point, a narrow line that would determine everything. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Elias Reed understood the full weight of death row in Texas. The endless waiting, the finality of the system, the shared burden of those still inside, and the unrelenting precision that dictated the rhythm of life and death in this place. Elias Reed sat in the chamber, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead vibrating in the silence. The metal cuffs pressed cold against his wrists, and the weight of the leather straps across his chest reminded him that this was no longer waiting. This was the final stage. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady the rhythm of his breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale, as if the numbers could tether him to the world outside. The guards moved with quiet precision, stepping back just enough to let the process unfold while remaining vigilant. Elias could feel the tension in the room, a living presence that pressed against his shoulders. Outside the chamber, life continued, streets, homes, children laughing. But in here, time had collapsed. Every second carried the weight of a life measured against the law. He thought about the years he had spent on death row, the endless monotony, the whispered conversations through food slots, the sight of men walking toward the chamber never to return. He thought of the younger inmates, like Ghost, still naive and untested, learning the harsh rhythm of survival in the coldest, most isolated corners of the system. He had been one of them once, and in the reflection of his own tattoos, the lone star on his forearm, the jagged arrow on his shoulder, he could see the boy he had been before everything went wrong. The spiritual advisor, a calm presence, knelt beside him, speaking quietly in measured tones. Elias listened, focusing not on the words but on the steadiness they provided. His thoughts drifted to his sister in Oklahoma, to the letters tucked safely in the small compartment of his pocket, to the photograph of her folded neatly inside. Life beyond these walls existed, and he carried its memory like a fragile flame, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something endured. The procedure began, clinical and methodical. Guards checked restraints, confirmed identities, and ensured that all protocols were observed. The room, white and unyielding, felt charged with expectation. Elias could hear every movement, the soft shuffling of boots, the clinking of metal, the low murmur of procedural instructions. Each sound sharpened his awareness, bringing the inevitability closer. And then it was time. Elias's breathing slowed, steadying as he braced against the gravity of the moment. He thought of the faces of those affected by his actions, the families, the victims, the loved ones whose lives had intersected with his crime. He had spent years reflecting, repenting, and preparing for this final step, yet nothing could fully contain the weight of reality pressing down. In the final moments, memories flooded him, moments of his life before prison, mistakes made, opportunities lost, fleeting acts of kindness that now seemed distant. The voices of guards, advisors, and witnesses became secondary to the internal rhythm of his heart, counting down in silent beats. He thought about the men he had left behind, about Ghost and Thompson and the countless others navigating the same corridors of fear and time. For them, this was a lesson in survival, a cautionary echo of the fate that awaited all who walked these halls. The minutes stretched, elastic and infinite, until the procedure reached its culmination. Time, condensed into each inhale, each heartbeat, became both expansive and finite. Elias focused on the memories that mattered most, his sister's face, the letters, the small photograph. In that narrow corridor between life and death, he held on to these fragments, the only truths he could carry forward. Afterward, the chamber emptied with practiced efficiency. Guards moved silently, carrying out final checks and preparing the room for the next stage. Outside, the world remained unchanged, oblivious to the human stories played out within these walls. Within, however, every act, every decision, every step had been magnified, etched into the collective memory of those who remained. Back at the Polunsky unit, the tier was quiet. Ghost lay on his bunk, tracing patterns on the concrete with his finger, his thoughts heavy. Thompson adjusted his blanket, the weight of shared experience pressing on him. For each man, the events of the day were both a reminder and a warning. That life on death row is measured not only by the hours spent waiting, but by the shadow of what is inevitable, a constant reminder of mortality and consequence. Elias Reed's journey ended in the silence of reflection, the rhythm of life and death intertwined in ways only those who endure this path can comprehend. The letters he had written, the memories he had preserved, the quiet strength he had mustered, all became part of the legacy he left behind. And for the men remaining on death row, his story became a living testament to the relentless passage of time, the precision of the system, and the fragile, indomitable persistence of human resilience. Later, The tier returned to its muted rhythm. Guards conducted rounds. Keys clattered. Doors opened and closed. And life continued in a manner both monotonous and sacred in its repetition. Each man carried forward the memory of what had occurred, the awareness that every day, every hour, could bring the next moment of reckoning. Elias's story, like those before him, remained part of the fabric of the prison, a caution, a reflection, a history etched into the walls, the bars, and the minds of all who witnessed. The tension, the fear, the resilience, and the small acts of humanity endured in the quiet moments between procedure and reflection. In the end, the Polonsky unit continued its work. Men arrived, men waited, men learned, and some departed. The system pressed forward with relentless precision, indifferent to individual stories, yet defined by them in every shadow, every whisper, every fleeting glance through a cell window. The stories of the men on Texas death row, Elias Reed among them, remained a complex tapestry of crime, consequence, and endurance. They were stories of human lives intersecting with the strict mechanisms of law, of resilience tested under unimaginable pressure, and of fleeting moments of grace and reflection amid the stark, unforgiving architecture of punishment. And for those watching beyond the walls, from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and beyond, the narrative held a grim fascination. It was a reminder of the gravity of decisions, the weight of justice, and the human lives bound within a system that moves steadily, inevitably, and without pause. Elias's chapter had ended, but the tier would continue, as it always did. Men would continue to arrive, to wait, to reflect, and to face the outcomes of choices, both their own and the world's. The echo of his presence, his tattoos, his resilience, and his final journey would linger, shaping the consciousness of those who remained. And for anyone observing, it was clear, death row in Texas is more than a place. It is a passage, a crucible, and a reflection of the human condition under the absolute certainty of consequence. For Elias Reed, the end had come. For the others, the path continued, each step heavy with awareness, each day a measure of endurance, and every moment a reminder that life and death walk hand in hand, separated only by circumstance, time, and the decisions of the law. In the silence of the corridor, in the empty bunks, and in the quiet reflection of the remaining men, a story concluded. Yet, the cycle persisted. The names on the list of inmates awaiting execution remained, etched into the records of Texas, and in the memory of every man who had survived, who had waited, and who had faced the ultimate question. How do you live, knowing the clock ticks steadily, unforgivingly, toward the inevitable? The story of death row in Texas is not just about crime or punishment. It is about the human lives caught in a system that is precise, relentless, and unyielding. Men like Elias Reed endure years of waiting, reflection, and fear, carrying memories, regrets, and fragments of hope. Each name on the list represents a story, a past, and a moment frozen in time. As we reflect on these lives, it is a stark reminder of the weight of justice, the gravity of choices, and the endurance of the human spirit under extreme circumstances. For every man who leaves these walls, countless others remain, watching, waiting, surviving, and learning what it truly means to face the edge of life itself. Death row is more than a list. It is a world defined by patience, fear, resilience, and the relentless march of time. And the stories of those who endure it will continue to fascinate, warn, and teach the world about the cost of crime, the depth of consequence, and the fragile power of human endurance. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.